I wasn't supposed to be standing there that night. I wasn't supposed to be pounding on the door of a stranger's house, my son's hand shaking in mine, but I had reached my limit. After weeks of watching him come home from school with new bruises, after hearing the cruel laughter echoing in his stories, after holding him while he cried quietly into his pillow so I wouldn't hear, something inside me broke. When the door opened, I expected defiance. I expected denial, excuses, maybe even rage. I was ready for all of it. What I wasn't ready for was the look on his face. The father of my son's bully didn't meet me with anger. He froze. His eyes locked onto Ethan, onto the scar stretching across his cheek, and in that instant, his whole body shifted. His jaw went slack, his chest tightened, and he took a step back as if he'd seen a ghost. I can't explain the chill that ran through me when I saw his reaction. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then, in a voice so low it almost cracked, he whispered words that I'll never forget. I recognized that scar. At first I thought I misheard him. How could he recognize it? This was a man I had never met before. A man who lived on the other side of town. A man whose son had spent weeks tormenting Ethan for the very same scar. And yet, the way he stared at it, the way his face drained of color, it was as if he carried some secret that connected him to us in ways I couldn't begin to understand. My son gripped my arm tighter. His eyes were wide, searching mine for answers, but I had none. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. I had come to demand accountability for what his child had done to mine. Instead, I found myself staring at a man who looked as though he had just seen the past come back to life on my son's face. And in that instant, I knew. This wasn't just about schoolyard bullying. This wasn't about kids being cruel. No, this was something else. Something buried. Something that had been waiting in the shadows, hidden behind years of silence. That scar, the one that had made my son a target, was about to tear open a story that neither of us were prepared to face. A story of betrayal, of heartbreak, of secrets that had been locked away for far too long. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Your support really helps me keep sharing these emotional true stories. My name is Claire, and I have always believed that strength is born out of survival. My son Ethan is proof of that. He's 12 years old, but in many ways, he has lived through more than some adults I know. He carries on his cheek a scar, a jagged reminder of a night that almost took him away from me forever. Years ago, when Ethan was only 5, we were in a car accident that changed everything. The crash came out of nowhere, and the glass from the shattered window cut deep across his face. He survived by a miracle, but the wound left its mark. Even after surgeries and treatments, the scar remained, carved into his skin like a permanent shadow of the past. While other parents worried about scraped knees and missing homework, I spent sleepless nights at his hospital bedside, whispering promises that he would never be defined by the mark he carried. When we moved to a new town, I thought maybe, just maybe, we could have a clean slate. It was supposed to be a fresh beginning. A new school, new neighbors, new chances. I told myself kids here wouldn't see the scar as a flaw, they'd see Ethan for the kind, gentle boy he truly was. Ethan was hopeful too, though I could see the fear behind his smile. On the morning of his first day, he stood in front of the mirror, tugging at his shirt collar as though it could hide what could never be hidden. His voice was small when he asked me, "Mom, do you think anyone will notice?" My heart broke, but I kissed his forehead and told him the truth. They'll notice. But what matters is who you are, not what they see. I wanted to believe my own words. I really did. That first day, as we pulled up to the school, Ethan gripped his backpack straps tightly, his shoulders stiff with nerves. I watched him walk through those front doors, so small against the sea of kids rushing past him, all chatter and laughter. And then, as I sat in the car, I noticed it, the subtle way heads turned, the way eyes lingered a little too long on his face. Whispers began before he even reached his classroom. I knew then that the world is rarely kind to those who look different. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into something crueler. At first, Ethan tried to brush it off. When I asked how school was, he forced a smile and said, "It's fine, Mom. Just fine." But I could see the heaviness in his eyes. The first real story came only after a week, when he admitted that during lunch, a boy had called him Frankenstein. He laughed it off as though it didn't matter, but his voice cracked just enough for me to hear the pain underneath. That boy's name was Tyler. Tyler was the kind of child every parent secretly fears their kid will meet the ringleader, sharp-tongued, brimming with confidence that crossed into cruelty. And once he found Ethan's weakness, he clung to it like a weapon. Tyler made sure everyone noticed the scar. He pointed it out in front of groups, made loud comments in the cafeteria, and turned it into a joke that others could laugh at. Children who might have befriended Ethan stayed silent, afraid of becoming Tyler's next target. Day by day, Ethan changed. He came home quieter, retreating into his room without the chatter he once shared about his day. His sketchbooks, once filled with superheroes and adventure stories, now sat untouched on his desk. He stopped looking people in the eye, and when I asked again if something was wrong, he only shook his head and whispered, "Please, Mom, don't make it worse." But I knew. I knew every bruise that appeared on his arm wasn't from playground roughhousing. I knew the lunches left uneaten weren't because he wasn't hungry, but because sitting alone in a crowded cafeteria was too painful. I knew that my boy, my brave boy who had survived an accident that nearly killed him, was now being broken in a different way, piece by piece, word by word. One afternoon, as I waited by the curb for him, I saw it with my own eyes. The doors of the school swung open, kids poured out, and then I spotted Ethan. His shirt was ripped, dirt smeared across his pants, his backpack half unzipped with papers spilling out. His face was flushed, not just with embarrassment, but with the sting of tears he was trying so hard not to let fall. My heart dropped into my stomach. When he reached me, I knelt down, brushing his hair back, and asked what had happened. He wouldn't answer. He only shook his head and looked away. His lips pressed together as if speaking the truth would make it worse. But in that moment, I didn't need his words. The evidence was right there in front of me. That was the breaking point for me as a mother. I had promised myself I would respect his wishes, that I wouldn't interfere unless absolutely necessary. But seeing my child torn apart, his spirit dimming day by day, was more than I could bear. That night, as I folded his ripped shirt and placed it gently in the laundry basket, my hands trembled with fury. Enough was enough, I whispered to myself, as if saying it aloud would give me strength. I can't stay silent anymore. And I meant it. When I finally decided to speak up, my first stop was the school itself. I wanted to believe that if I explained what was happening, if I laid everything out clearly, the adults in charge would step in and protect my child. Isn't that what schools are supposed to do? Isn't that what we're promised as parents, that our children will be safe the moment we hand them over at those doors? So I walked into the principal's office, holding Ethan's torn shirt in my hands like evidence in a courtroom. I told them about the bruises, the cruel names, the way my son had stopped eating, stopped smiling, stopped believing he belonged. I waited for shock, for outrage, for someone to rise up and say, "This will not stand." But what I received instead was a sigh. The principal, a man in a neatly pressed suit with pictures of smiling students framed behind him, leaned back in his chair and said the words that still make my stomach twist. "Kids will be kids. Kids will be kids." As though tormenting a child for the scar that nearly cost him his life was the same as arguing over a toy or cutting in line at lunch. As though cruelty could be excused, brushed aside, minimized, until it no longer mattered. The teachers nodded politely, their faces blank. They suggested Ethan could sit closer to the front of the classroom. They suggested he try ignoring the comments. They suggested patience, as if patience could shield him from fists and laughter. I walked out of that building with fire in my chest. My son's pain had been handed back to me, as though it was mine alone to carry. And as I drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, I made a decision. If the school would not protect him, then I would. If those who were supposed to uphold justice for children refused, then I would confront the source of the cruelty myself. That night, I searched until I found the address I needed. Tyler's father. His name was Mark. I said it out loud just to feel the weight of it. Mark. The man who had raised a child so comfortable in mocking another's pain. The man who had allowed cruelty to grow under his roof. A week later, I stood on his quiet suburban street. The houses there looked so perfect: trimmed lawns, bicycles leaning against porches, mailboxes decorated for the season. It was the kind of neighborhood meant to look safe, ordinary, untouched by ugliness. But my heart was pounding because I knew that ugliness lived here, behind one of these doors. I walked up the pathway, Ethan beside me. He didn't want to come, but I needed him there. I needed him to see me standing tall for him, refusing to shrink back anymore. His hand trembled in mine, but I squeezed it gently and whispered, "I've got you." When I knocked, the door opened quickly, as though Mark had been expecting company. He stood tall, confident, the kind of man who filled a doorway with ease. At first, there was nothing unusual about his face: polite smile, cautious curiosity. I introduced myself, though my voice shook with the weight of my anger. I told him plainly who I was, who my son was, and what his child had been doing at school. I didn't hold back. Every bruise, every cruel word, every moment Ethan had been made to feel like less than human spilled from my lips. I waited for him to deny it, to argue, to push back. But then Ethan shifted forward, just enough for the light from the porch to fall across his face. His scar caught the glow, sharp and undeniable, and in that instant, everything changed. Mark's smile collapsed. His posture stiffened. His skin turned a shade paler than I thought possible. His eyes widened, not with surprise, but with something heavier, something that looked almost like recognition. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then gripped the edge of the door frame, as though the world was suddenly tilting beneath him. I frowned, confused. This was not the reaction I had expected. Anger, yes. Denial, absolutely. Even indifference I could have handled. But this was different. This was fear. And then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached me, he whispered words that knocked the air from my lungs. I recognized that scar. For a moment, the world froze. My son stiffened beside me, his small fingers digging into my arm. His eyes darted up to mine, wide with panic and confusion. I could feel his silent plea, the desperate need for me to explain, to make sense of what had just been said. But I had no explanation. I stood there, rooted to the ground, my own mind racing. Recognize it? How could he recognize something that belonged only to Ethan? How could this man, this stranger, speak as though the scar was familiar to him, as though it carried a memory we didn't share? My throat tightened. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. And in that stretched-out silence, the weight of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I pulled Ethan closer, my voice low, steadying him though my own body shook. "It's okay, honey," I whispered, though it was a lie, because nothing about that moment was okay. Mark's eyes never left the scar. His lips pressed into a thin line, as though he had already said too much. And then, without another word, he stepped back into the shadows of his home, leaving us standing on his porch, the unanswered question burning between us. Ethan tugged at my sleeve, his voice small, fragile. "Mom, what does he mean by that?" I couldn't answer. I could only hold him tighter, staring at the closed door, knowing that whatever truth had just begun to reveal itself would not stay hidden for long. The night after that strange encounter, I couldn't sleep. Mark's words replayed over and over in my mind like a broken record. I recognized that scar. It wasn't the kind of thing you said casually. It wasn't the kind of thing you could mistake. Recognition meant knowledge, and knowledge meant he wasn't a stranger at all. The next morning, I went back. I didn't tell Ethan why, we simply drove in silence. My heart beat like a drum, each thud louder than the last as we pulled into the same quiet street. This time, I didn't knock politely. I rang the bell and stood tall, daring him not to answer. The door opened slowly. Mark's eyes met mine, and I saw it instantly: the hesitation, the dread, the weight of something he had carried too long. He didn't look like a confident father now. He looked like a man cornered. "I need you to explain," I said. My voice didn't shake this time. I was done being polite. "What do you mean, you recognize my son's scar?" He swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he motioned for me to step inside. Ethan stayed glued to my side, his small frame pressed against me, sensing the danger in the air. The house was too neat, too quiet, as if every cushion and picture frame had been carefully placed to distract from the storm brewing within its walls. Mark sat down heavily in an armchair, his shoulders sagging. For a long moment, he said nothing. And then, finally, the words came out halting, broken, heavy with guilt. Years ago, I did something. Something I've buried so deep I thought it would never find me again. I clenched my fists, my pulse hammering. It was late at night. I was driving home from a bar. I shouldn't have been behind the wheel, but I told myself I was fine. The roads were empty, or so I thought. And then, it happened. He closed his eyes, as though seeing it all again. A boy, small, crossing the road. I didn't have time to stop. I hit him. I heard the sound of his body. God help me. I can still hear it. He hit the ground, and I panicked. I got out, saw the blood, the way his face was torn, and I knew he might not survive. My breath caught in my throat. My legs trembled beneath me, but I forced myself to stand still. And then? I whispered. Mark's voice cracked. I ran. I left him there. I got back in my car and drove away. I never looked back. For a moment, the air was sucked out of the room. My vision blurred with rage and memory. Because I knew that night. I knew it too well. Years ago, I had been woken by the sound of sirens, by a phone call that shattered my world. Ethan had been hit by a car, left on the road, bleeding, broken. I had rushed to the hospital and seen him fighting for his life. I had watched tubes and machines keep him alive. I had prayed every hour, begged God to let him live. His face had been torn open. Surgeons working for hours to save him, leaving behind the scar that now marked him forever. And this man sitting before me, was the one who had done it. My voice came out trembling, thick with fury. You left him there to die. Mark flinched. His eyes welled up, but I had no sympathy. I had carried the weight of that night for years. The sleepless nights by hospital beds, the sound of Ethan's cries when he woke in pain, the endless surgeries, the way other children stared and whispered, all of it had been our burden. While Mark went home, washed the blood off his car, and pretended nothing had happened. You watched my son suffer from the shadows, I spat. And you raised your own child without ever telling him the monster you really are. Mark lowered his face into his hands. His voice was muffled. I never told anyone. I thought it was behind me. I thought he had died. I carried that guilt, but I never imagined. Never imagined what? I snapped. That one day you'd look into the eyes of the boy you left to bleed out on the pavement? He looked at Ethan then, really looked at him. My son stood there silently, his scar catching the light again. A living reminder of the crime that should have destroyed him. Ethan's chest rose and fell quickly, his lips parted in horror as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a bully's father. This wasn't just a man who failed to raise his son with kindness. This was the man who had nearly stolen his life. Mark shook his head slowly. I never meant, don't you dare. I cut him off, my voice like steel. You don't get to soften this. You don't get to rewrite what you did. You left a child alone on a cold road, and you walked away. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan's hand slipped into mine, trembling. I could feel his confusion, his fear, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He was too young to carry this truth, but it was ours now, heavy and unrelenting. I stared at Mark, studying the man who had haunted us without our knowledge. His son Tyler had no idea. He had grown up spoiled, arrogant, unscarred by his father's secret. And suddenly, it all made sense. Tyler's cruelty, his arrogance, it was as if the darkness of his father's sin had seeped into him without ever being spoken aloud. I turned to leave. I couldn't stay in that house another second. But before I stepped out the door, I looked back at him one last time. You think this ends with your confession? I said coldly. No, this is only the beginning. I pulled Ethan close, holding him tightly as we walked away. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of a man breaking down, but it didn't matter. His tears meant nothing to me. What mattered was the truth. The truth that had been buried for years was finally mine to hold, and I would not stop until I uncovered every piece of it. As we reached the car, Ethan's small voice broke through the silence. Mom, he whispered, his eyes wide. What are we going to do now? I looked down at him, brushing the hair from his forehead, my heart breaking at the fear in his eyes. We're going to find out everything, sweetheart, I said firmly. Every secret, every lie. He doesn't get to walk away this time. And as I drove away from that perfect suburban street, determination surged through me like fire. Mark thought he had hidden from his past, but he had no idea what it meant to face a mother who had nothing left to lose. The first thing I did was treat the past like a case file. I spread everything out on my kitchen table the way detectives do in TV shows, photos, dates, the tiny scrap of paper with the hospital room number I'd kept all those years. And I told myself I would follow every lead until the truth could no longer hide. It felt strange, turning memory into paperwork. But grief had to be useful now. It had to become a tool. I started where the facts began. The police report from the night Ethan was hit, the emergency room intake logs, the surgeon's notes that described the damage and the hours spent fighting to save a small life. The copies I had were photocopies from years ago, yellowed at the edges, but they held names and times that should have been fixed points. What I didn't expect was how loose those points would be. Dates that didn't align, officers whose names were scribbled without badge numbers, a patrol car listed as responding that didn't show up on any adjacent logs. It was the kind of sloppy paperwork that asked to be questioned. I spent days on the phone, calling hospital archives and the county records office. Each transfer connected me to another voice that repeated the same thing. Records were stored, sometimes misplaced, sometimes incomplete. When I finally got hold of the original intake sheet, one tiny line leapt out at me like a missed stitch in a tapestry. The responding officer's name matched the name of a man I had known in my old neighborhood, someone I'd once trusted. I felt my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. The town where I had left pieces of my life still had threads tied to the present. The more I dug, the more the neat story I'd been told unraveled. A county attorney's memo suggested that an investigation had begun, but never concluded. There were mentions of witness statements that were marked confidential and then redacted entirely. Hospital notes referenced a car description that did not match the vehicle my memory held. Somewhere along the line, pieces of what had happened that night had been removed or altered. It was the kind of erosion that doesn't happen by accident. Then came the discovery that made my hands go cold. A name appearing repeatedly in the margins of unrelated documents. A small attorney's firm known for smoothing over problems for certain clients. That firm had represented a local businessman for years, his influence bending small-town currents in ways most people never noticed. The name of that businessman matched the last name of a woman who had attended my son's preschool bake sales and who I had once considered a friend. Betrayal seldom arrives as a sudden blow. It arrives as a slow, dawning realization that people you trusted were standing on the other side of the room while the ground was being pulled out from beneath you. I pulled up old neighborhood photographs on my laptop, faces from block parties, 4th of July barbecues, school fundraisers. There she was, smiling in one picture with that same powerful man beside her. I remembered having coffee in her kitchen and confiding, in passing, how exhausted I was after Ethan's surgeries. I had never suspected that her smile could be the cost of silence. I kept following the paper trail. Name after name emerged. An insurance adjuster who had been unusually quick to close the claim. A tow company whose logs had a gap of 2 hours that night. A mechanic who claimed he'd repaired a car the next morning, but provided no invoice. All of it formed a web that pointed towards someone with the means and the will to make things disappear. The kind of person whose money and reputation could bend a report or bury a complaint in a stack of routine files. At home, the house felt like a courtroom chamber. Ethan watched me work with a quiet, fearful interest. I could see the questions in his eyes, questions I hadn't been prepared to answer when all I wanted was to protect him. The discovery forced us both into a new kind of honesty. There were nights he asked small, sharp things. Was I supposed to die? Did he know it was me? Why didn't anyone come back? The words landed like hard stones. I had to shape my answers carefully. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I could frame it so he would not feel like the center of someone else's cowardice. I told him the blunt truth that a child should never have to hear, but I wrapped it in what I thought he needed to keep moving forward. He was not an accident in the way men like Mark behaved. He was the result of my fierce perseverance, of the doctors who fought for him, of nights where hope refused to leave us. His life had been stolen and then returned to him, and for that stolen time we owed ourselves no shame. The questions about why someone left those were for the people who had chosen to walk away. While I tried to protect Ethan's sense of safety, a different part of me began to plan. I am not a litigious woman by nature, but I understood leverage. The sort of exposure that unravels the comfortable veneer of small-town respectability doesn't need to be dramatic to be effective. It requires method, patience, and the ability to place a single, undeniable pebble on a carefully tended glass house and watch it spread cracks. I was not interested in revenge that matched violence with violence. I wanted something more incisive, consequences that would take away what he valued: his reputation, his standing in the community, the presumptions of immunity he'd grown up believing in. I started by documenting everything in a single, organized binder. Copies of police documents, notes from hospital staff, dates and times, the names of people who had been conveniently absent the night Ethan was found. I made spreadsheets. I printed out photographs and circled details until they made a map I could follow. I wrote letters to public records offices requesting missing files. I filed formal complaints where applicable. I refused to let bureaucracy be a barrier. Instead, I used it as scaffolding, climbing one formality at a time until I could see the joints holding the story together. At night, while Ethan slept, I drafted emails that I would never send and left them as drafts to make myself think clearly. I sent anonymous tips to investigative reporters at a regional paper, careful to lay out facts and not speculation. I reached out to an old friend who worked at a nonprofit focused on abuse survivors, asking for advice on how to navigate public exposure without harming my son's privacy. She responded with a bluntness I admired: "Truth is a tool. Use it. Don't let it turn you into the person you hate." I kept that note pinned on the bulletin board above my desk as a moral compass. The more I unearthed, the more it became clear that Mark had allies. They weren't conspiring in a dramatic cloak and dagger way. They were ordinary people who valued their comforts more than confronting pain. A neighbor who had once offered me casseroles after Ethan's surgeries had been in contact with Mark in the months after the accident. A local store owner I'd babysat for had given a friendly ride to a man whose license plate matched the partial number in the tow truck records. These were not grand betrayals. They were small acts of omission that, when added together, made a kind of consent. Ethan began to retreat into silence again, but this time it was different. The silence was not born of shame, but of a processing that happens after truth reveals itself in ugly detail. In the evenings, he would sit by the window for long stretches, tracing the scar with a fingertip while the streetlight painted his face in pale gold. I used those quiet moments to remind him of the person he was beyond the scar. I told him stories of his stubborn bravery in the hospital, the way he held my hand when machines hissed beside us, the small ways he had chosen to live. He listened and sometimes offered a terse smile. Sometimes he asked a question I couldn't answer without falling apart. Did he mean to leave me? I told him I didn't know his intentions that night, only his actions. I explained that some people run not because they are innocent, but because their fear is louder than their conscience. Those were words for an older child, but they were also the truth I needed to believe as I plotted the next steps. I swore silently, then aloud in a whisper so that the house would hear, that I would make the man who had left my child face the consequences of his choices in a way he could not ignore. I imagined no courtroom drama, no violent confrontations, only the slow, inexorable unmasking that strips someone of the things they thought would protect them: influence, respect, the quiet complacency of neighbors who prefer their peace to the pain of others. I would not stoop to malice, but I would be strategic and unrelenting. I began by seeding questions where they would be noticed. I handed copies of the inconsistencies to a lawyer I had met at a community meeting, not to sue, but to ask whether these documents suggested official neglect or intentional concealment. I made a point of speaking with parents at school events, casually asking if anyone remembered the night of the accident in ways that could later be corroborated. I did not accuse, I asked. Questions have a reputation of their own, and spoken in the right tone, they make people uncomfortable enough to examine what they have taken for granted. At night, when the house was quiet and the only sound was the refrigerator humming, I would sit at my table and map the next move. The plan was simple in principle and complicated in execution. Gather indisputable facts, place them where they could not be ignored, and allow the community to respond. I would not attack Mark with slander or rumor. I would present truth documented, dry, and impossible to dismiss, and then watch as the consequences followed of their own accord. Ethan slept through much of this, but sometimes he would wake and pad into the kitchen, climb onto a chair, and watch me work. I would look at him, and he would look at me, and a silent agreement passed between us. We would not let this define the rest of our lives, but we would not pretend it hadn't happened either. I wanted him to learn that strength can be quiet. It can be the steady accumulation of small, righteous actions that, together, bring down a man who once thought he could walk away. And so I began, slowly, deliberately, turning the past into a present that could no longer be hidden. The first time I slipped an envelope into his world, I felt my own hands shaking. It wasn't anger this time, it was precision. I had chosen every page, every word, every image carefully. Inside was a photocopy of the original accident report, with nothing but the officer's name circled in red. No threats, no accusations. Just the truth that had been hidden, placed before him in stark, undeniable ink. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. Truth doesn't need a signature, it speaks for itself. I mailed it to his office, not his home. That way, the cracks would appear where his professional mask mattered most. I imagined the moment he opened it sitting at his desk, maybe with a colleague nearby, his hand pausing when he saw what had been slipped between the folds of his day. I imagined the sweat rising on his forehead, the old panic flooding back. Because secrets don't decay quietly, they rot, and when disturbed, the stench fills every corner of a man's life. Weeks passed, and I kept my rhythm steady. The second envelope arrived at his workplace with nothing but a grainy photo of Ethan, taken years ago in the hospital bed, stitches glistening across his small face. The kind of photo no parent forgets, the kind of image no guilty man could look at without hearing the echo of tires on asphalt. Again, no signature. Just a reminder, the past was not gone. It was alive, breathing at his neck. And then, the whispers began. It didn't take much. A casual mention to a PTA mother about strange old stories I'd heard. A small question at a community meeting. Do you remember that unsolved hit and run from years ago? I didn't accuse. I didn't point fingers. But in towns like ours, stories move quickly. Whispers multiply faster than confessions. And soon enough, people were asking questions not because I pushed them to, but because silence is heavy, and they could sense marks. At home, I began to notice Tyler changing. The boy who had tormented Ethan, who had laughed at his scar in the cafeteria, suddenly stopped. The smirk disappeared from his face. He avoided Ethan in the hallways. He didn't throw cruel nicknames anymore. The truth is, children know when something is wrong with the adults they depend on. Tyler must have felt the shift in his father before anyone else did. Maybe he heard late-night arguments through the walls, or maybe he noticed how his father jumped whenever the phone rang. Whatever the reason, the boy who had once been bold was now cautious, withdrawn. And in that silence, my son began to breathe easier. But Mark himself, he was unraveling. Slowly at first, then faster. I could see it in his eyes when we passed each other at school functions, the way his gaze darted nervously, the way he seemed to carry weight in his shoulders he hadn't carried before. He looked like a man perpetually waiting for a blow he couldn't see. It wasn't long before his reputation began to corrode. He missed deadlines at work. Colleagues whispered about his sudden mood swings, and an anonymous package, another from me, found its way to his employer's desk. Inside, a copy of the memo that had been buried all those years ago, the one that referenced an unresolved child pedestrian accident. Again, nothing overtly pointing to him, just enough to raise questions. Enough to stain his spotless image. The final fracture came inside his own home. I heard about it later, but I could picture it vividly. His wife had cornered him one evening, her voice raised, holding an envelope in her hands. One of mine had slipped through to their mailbox, not their office. She had seen the accident photos, the circled names, the unspoken accusations. She had asked him the only question that mattered. What are these rumors about you? I could imagine the way her face must have looked, pale with shock, eyes wide with the sudden understanding that the man she had shared her life with was not the man she thought he was. I could imagine her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disgust as she repeated the question he couldn't answer without shattering everything. It must have gutted him. because the next day, word spread that he hadn't shown up to work at all. Neighbors whispered that they'd heard shouting, doors slamming, late-night footsteps pacing in the yard. His carefully constructed life was buckling under the weight of a truth he had tried so hard to bury. And then, one night, as the street outside my home lay quiet, headlights swept across my living room wall. I peered through the curtains and saw his car parked crookedly at the curb. A moment later, there was a pounding at my door, loud, desperate, not the knock of a man with control, but the frantic hammering of someone unraveling. I opened the door, not out of pity, but because I wanted to see him fall apart with my own eyes. And there he was, Mark, disheveled, his face pale and wet with sweat. His voice cracked as he spoke, his words tumbling out like stones he could no longer carry. "Please," he begged, his hands shaking. "Please, you have to stop. Whatever you're doing, it has to end. You don't understand what this is doing to me, to my family." I stood there in silence, letting his desperation hang in the air. My son's scar flashed through my mind. The long nights in the hospital, the years of whispers and bullying, the countless moments of pain. And now here was the man responsible, begging me to stop the very thing he had once begged fate to allow him to walk away unscathed. I didn't answer him right away. I just let him stand there, trembling on my doorstep, while the weight of his guilt pressed down harder than anything I could ever say. He stood on my porch, trembling like a man whose foundation had finally crumbled. His fists balled, not in anger, but in desperation, as though holding on to the last scraps of a life that was slipping through his fingers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the door. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Instead, I let the silence breathe until it pressed heavy between us, and then I spoke with the kind of calm that cuts deeper than any scream ever could. "You broke my son once," I said softly, each word deliberate, "but this time, you broke yourself. You broke yourself." He flinched, as if the truth itself had claws. His eyes searched mine, looking for mercy, but I had none left to give. For years I had carried the weight of his cowardice, the silence of a community that had looked the other way, the scars etched into my child's skin. And now the weight had shifted. It was his turn to carry it. He muttered something incoherent, a plea, a justification, words that dissolved as quickly as they left his lips. Then he stumbled back, down my steps, into the night, his shadow shrinking with every step he took away from me. I thought that was the end of it. But fate is crueler than either of us could have imagined. Because in the days that followed, it wasn't me who brought the truth crashing into his home, it was his own son, Tyler. I wasn't there when it happened, but I was told about it later by a neighbor who overheard the chaos through thin walls. Mark's wife had cornered him again, her patience worn thin, her trust stripped bare. She demanded answers about the letters, about the photos, about the rumors she could no longer ignore. Her voice rose, fierce and unrelenting. And in that storm of accusation, Mark snapped. He confessed, not fully, not cleanly, but enough. Enough for Tyler, standing at the top of the stairs, to hear every damning word. The boy who had once mocked Ethan, who had delighted in cruelty, stood frozen as the foundation of his world cracked open beneath him. He learned, in that single terrible moment, that his father was not the man he pretended to be. Not the man who tucked him in at night, not the man who carried himself with pride in public. No, his father was a coward who had struck a child with his car and driven away. His father was the reason another boy bore a scar that had become the target of Tyler's ridicule. Shock first, then disbelief, then the humiliation of knowing his own cruelty had mirrored his father's crime. I heard that Tyler didn't speak to his father for days. He avoided him at breakfast, refused to look him in the eye. And at school, something shifted. The taunts stopped. The whispers died. Ethan walked through the hallways without hearing that mocking laugh behind him. For the first time in years, my son wasn't shrinking in the shadow of another boy. Tyler's silence was his apology, unspoken but felt. But the story didn't stop in their home. Secrets rarely stay locked away when they begin to unravel. What had started as anonymous letters, as whispers in the dark, now poured out into the light. Someone at Mark's workplace leaked the files, the accident report, the photographs, the officer's notes. It spread like wildfire through the community, passed hand to hand, whispered at grocery store lines, murmured on church steps after Sunday service. Mark's name was no longer synonymous with respectability. It was synonymous with betrayal. The outrage was swift and merciless. Parents who had once trusted him no longer wanted him near their children. Friends who had once invited him to dinner now crossed the street to avoid him. His employer, unwilling to bear the stain of his past, quietly severed ties. And the man who had strutted through life with arrogance found himself standing in the wreckage of a reputation he had spent decades building. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. I didn't shout his name from rooftops. I didn't drag him to court or force a confession. I simply let the truth breathe. The truth did what I could not. It stripped him bare before the world. There were moments when people asked me if I felt triumphant, if seeing him fall gave me the satisfaction I had long craved. The answer was more complicated than yes or no. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was release. Release from the silence I had carried. Release from the ache of injustice. Release from the long nights staring at my son's scar, wondering if the man who caused it would ever pay. Because in the end, he did pay. Not with prison bars or handcuffs, but with something far heavier. The slow, public disintegration of everything he valued. His family's trust, his community's respect, his son's love. And as I watched the pieces of his life scatter in the wind, I didn't need to say another word. He had already heard the only truth that mattered. You broke my son once, but this time, you broke yourself. When the storm finally passed, I found myself standing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had unfolded. The pieces of this twisted puzzle had fallen into place not because I forced them to, but because the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. I looked at my son, Ethan, and for the first time in years, I saw light in his eyes that had been missing since the accident. The boy who once came home from school with his shoulders hunched, his voice soft, his spirit shrinking under the weight of mockery, now began to stand taller. Each day, little by little, I saw him reclaim pieces of himself that Tyler and the whispers had tried to strip away. The hallways at school were quieter now. Tyler no longer lingered in the shadows with cruel words ready to fly. He walked differently, his head bowed, his shoulders heavy with knowledge he could not unhear. For the first time, it was he who carried the shame, not Ethan. And in that reversal, something inside me settled. I didn't rejoice in Tyler's brokenness. He was just a boy, after all, caught in the reflection of his father's sins. But I saw something change in him too. He kept his distance from Ethan, yes, but I noticed something else, an awkward silence, a hesitation where his cruelty used to be. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps, finally, it was understanding. As for Mark, he was no longer the man who had once stood tall in this neighborhood, admired for his charm and confidence. He was a shell now, dragged down by the weight of his own lies. His name carried no respect, no admiration, only whispers of shame. The man who had once believed he was untouchable had been undone without a single hand raised against him. That was the revenge. Not loud, not violent, just inevitable. And in that space, I turned my focus back to Ethan, because he deserved more than to live in the shadow of what had been done to him. He deserved to write his own story, not be forever bound to the scar that marked his skin. It happened one afternoon when the school announced auditions for the spring play. Ethan came home with the flyer crumpled in his hand, his eyes flickering with a mix of fear and longing. I saw the question forming in him: could he dare to stand on a stage, under the lights, where no scar could hide? He didn't ask aloud, but I answered anyway. Do it, Ethan. Don't let them define you. Show them who you are. He auditioned, nervous, stumbling at first. But he tried. And when the cast list went up, his name was there. He had earned his role, not because they pitied him, but because he was good enough. The night of the performance, I sat in the front row, my hands clenched together so tightly they ached. And when the curtain rose, I saw my son walk out onto that stage, head held high, scar gleaming under the lights like a badge instead of a burden. For a moment, the theater was silent, and then the applause came loud, unhesitating, filling every corner of that room. They weren't clapping for his scar. They were clapping for his strength. And in that instant, I knew we had won, not against Mark, not against Tyler, not even against the accident. We had won against the silence, the shame, the fear. Ethan's scar was no longer a mark of pain, it was proof of survival, proof that no amount of cruelty could erase his spirit. I went home that night, tucked him into bed, and as he drifted to sleep with a smile on his face, I let the weight finally slip from my shoulders. The revenge had already happened. Quiet, patient, complete. Mark had destroyed himself with the very truth he tried to bury, and Ethan had risen above the ashes of his cruelty. And if there is anything I've learned, it is this. Scars tell stories. Not of weakness, not of shame, but of survival. They remind us that we endured, that we fought, that we came out the other side. And sometimes, the cruelest revenge is not shouting, not fighting, not breaking someone with your hands. Sometimes, the cruelest revenge is simply letting the truth breathe. If you've stayed with me until the end, give this video a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And please drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Your support keeps me going and helps more people find these powerful stories.